Good morning to everybody. We start session 3 with two very important papers, and we are expected around 11:15 more or less to go to the purple audience, so we have a very strict time. Let's start with a presentation by Monsignor Roland Minnerath, who is Archbishop of Dijon and member of the Academy. Please, Monsignor Minnerath.
Thank you, Chairman. Dear colleagues, conflicts between nations are as old as history may record. A deep inquiry into the reasons why nations are enemies in principle is needed. There is no commonly accepted definition of a nation. For instance, the United Nations are made up of 197 independent states, 194 of which are member states, and 4 not members. Unofficial statistics pretend that there would be 324 national entities according to their cultural identity. The criterion of independent territory does not take into account the claims of those self-conscious nations which long for independence as they are living under the rule of a dominant state. Nations cannot be apprehended only through the legal category of the state. So it seems correct to admit that nations and states do not necessarily overlap, even though the current language merges both into nation-states. First, a people as a given reality. For correct analysis, it seems proper to start from the emergence of human groups distinguish themselves from other groups. In the 5th century before Christ, Herodotus inquired about 100 ethne in the ancient world. An ethnos can be described as a people. A people are a natural grouping of human beings characterized by common features, religion, customs, language, economic and political system, a territory, and a mythical narrative of their origin. So peoples are a given reality. Peoples could be constituted in tribes, like the Germans or the Celts, or organized in cities, like the Greeks. We could rely on Herodotus' assumption that the people tends to be autonomous and govern themselves as distinct from other peoples. Today, indigenous populations enjoy the UN Declaration of 2007, which protects their identity. They represent the ethnic conception of a people. The Romans considered themselves as a populus, a political body with a constitution, whereas the surrounding peoples were natural ethnic peoples. The Roman populus was made up of various neighbor peoples. The city is a res publica, shared by all citizens. The Roman Empire grew by integration of conquered peoples into the Roman citizenship. At the end of the 18th century, the American and French revolutions picked up this political notion of people as opposed to the natural ethnic meaning of people. The other well-known example is Israel in Old Testament times. The elected people qualified themselves as Ham, Laos, distinct from the Goyim, ethne, the nations. When the Bible speaks of the event of Babel, it mentions the division of humanity into 70 ethne, or nations, each one with its own language. A people are not a static or closed reality. Along the years, a people formed on an ethnic basis may integrate individuals or groups coming from other origins and disposed to share the saga of the adopted people. Along history, some people disappear and others impose their domination by assimilation of the oppressed. As early as the 4th century before Christ, Isocrates said that being a Greek means no longer a common ethnical origin, but a common culture or paideia. So being a people entails the vision of a trans-ethnical community. Then when is a nation born? When do a people become a nation? Or are peoples always synonymous with nations? The word nation refers to the place where you were born. It is also a given reality. A nation is a result of the will of a people to live together, to share the same institutions, to refer to common roots in history. So nations may be made up of various peoples or of members coming from various peoples. In modern times, we have an example with the USA. Most nations are composed of peoples from different origins. So what characterizes a nation is the voluntary moral bond of citizens who wish to share a common destiny. It is important to note, however, how foreigners are perceived by self-conscious nations. A well-known example is ancient Greece, for which the surrounding peoples were barbarians, which means speaking not understandable languages. Current hostility between nations is still fueled by irrational feelings of contempt and fear of others. Criteria such as language, religion, way of life, culture are not conclusive to make up a nation. Now the native land, the concept of fatherland, patria, evokes the land of the ancestors, where one feels at home. It can also mean the place where one has chosen to live as his new homeland. A homeland is always a territory. A feeling of belonging ties, deep links with one's fatherland. This feeling may take on gradual degrees of belongingness to the village, the region, the vast nation. Cicero said he had two patrias, his home city of Tusculum and his great Roman patria. The first was contained in the latter. At the end of the Roman Empire, a poet worshipped Rome as having put together many nations into a single fatherland. Now the state. The state is the organized legal structure of a people, a nation, or in some cases of more nations. The state is an abstract entity. Up to the 16th century, the abstract concept of state was not used. Political power was seen as identified with the person of the ruler. In modern times, the state appeared as the bearer of sovereignty on a specific territory. In political science, the notion of societas preceded the notion of state. A societas is an ordered human group with recognized institutions, laws, administrative structure. Luigi Tabarelli d'Azeglio elaborated the concept of primary legal order, which is not derived from a higher legal order and which is not subject to another organized society. Those perfect societies who live according to their own original juridical institutions are sovereign societies. This means that they have reached the category of a state, but not necessarily of a territorial state. History witnesses a large number of types of states. States covering a single people are rare. Most states are constituted by either voluntary nations or even by several nations enjoying a large autonomy, as the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. I know at least one state without a people or a nation, and this is the Vatican City states. States may pre-exist to nations, as in Africa, the Middle East, where colonial powers artificially delimited territories, cutting off tribes and comprehending populations with different traditions and languages. So states tried to create nations at the expense of the neighbor states, which used the same divided nations to build up their own feeling of belonging. All states are constructs, not given realities. Very often, states include national minorities coming from immigrant groups who do not belong to the main national group. They may become either assimilated, integrated, or apartheid. The monarchical absolute sovereign state, the crucial concept is the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty is paramount in understanding the relation between nation and state. Up to the modern times, the ruler was considered as endowed with majestas or imperium. In modern times, the bearer of political power shifted from the individual monarch to the permanent monarch, according to the distinction of the two bodies of the king, illustrated by Kantorowicz. So was born the state as an abstract expression of the permanent supreme authority regulating a community. The modern state was born in the context of monarchical absolutism, not as a request of the nation. According to Machiavelli, the absolute monarch was gradually disconnected from the order in which he had to play his role. He became absolute in himself. Sovereignty rested in his person. So sovereignty became the attribute of the permanent monarch of the state. However, two doctrines of sovereignty appeared which are still consistent today. The first one was exposed by Jean-Baptiste Baudin. Sovereignty means the highest level of power whatsoever. It is conceived as unique and indivisible, virtually unlimited, and affecting all aspects of life. Sovereignty became strictly associated with a territory. Baudin theorized the centralized monarchical state, which could only have competitive relations with other sovereign states. In the Protestant era, the German Johannes Althusius developed another concept of sovereignty, starting from the bottom, from the consent of the people, and giving to local and regional communities a share in sovereignty, according to the principle of subsidiarity. He fosters the idea of federalism instead of centralization, not without a reference to the Holy Roman Empire of his time. From the Westphalia treatises up to the creation of the Society of Nations, Europe will have only independent sovereign states. In the meantime, sovereignty will change its bearer from the monarch to the nation. This new step brings us into the present comprehension of nation and nation-state. The nation as an expression of people's sovereignty. After the monarchical absolute sovereign state, we had the sovereign nation-state. The American and French revolutions imposed the idea of the nation as resulting from the conquest of sovereignty by the people. We, the people, says the Constitution of the United States. The French Revolution transferred to the nation the sovereignty exercised by the monarch. The nation so appears as a unity, not of different peoples, but of individuals, enjoying equal rights and claiming for political independence. The nation is a voluntarist community of citizens sharing the same institutions, like the Populus Romanus of ancient times. It is interesting to note that the first French constitution of 1791 indicates that sovereignty belongs to the nation. In the constitution of 1793, it is said sovereignty rests with the French people. And in the constitution of 1795, sovereignty resides in the University of Citizens. So nation is in danger to form a conceptual entity in itself, without precise connection with the real people in its diversity. This vision of a nation was associated with state sovereignty. It can be said that the state played the major role in the definition of the nation. The state used the idea of nation as a legitimation for its claim for sovereignty inside its territory and towards neighbor states. The liberal nation identified itself with a republican state. Locke and Rousseau were its theorists. The second conception of the nation was linked with the emerging national feeling in Europe. It started in the 18th century in the form of a strong revival of ancestral cultures as a reaction against the French-speaking elites. So the Celts discovered the roots of their peoples prior to the Roman conquest, the Slavish peoples prior to the German or Turkish domination. Languages and national epics were literally invented. The Germans, who were always divided into many states, considered being united by their language. After the Napoleonic Wars, the national feeling was boosted by the Romanticist movement and a strong wish for nations to gain back more autonomy within multinational empires like Austria, Russia, or the Ottoman Empire. The nation was viewed as an organic body, with given elements like the same language, a same culture, a same shared history. This position was defended in the German area by poets and philosophers like Herder, Fichte and Schleiermacher around the concept of folk, evoking the idea of a culturally homogeneous people. Today, the nation is the only legitimation of the sovereign state. Yet the association of sovereign and national states is a construct of post-Westphalia and post-1848 revolution times. It is remarkable that Taparelli d'Azeglio's theory of the perfect societies stressed that the Catholic Church fulfills the criteria of an independent sovereign society endowed with a primary original legal system called canon law. In the Concordates signed between the Holy See and many states in the last 30 years, the sovereignty, independence, and autonomy of both the Church and the state are strongly stressed. The sovereignty of the Church refers to the sphere of her own competence. So there can be a form of sovereignty which goes beyond the sphere of territorial states. The national state under the rule of law, the nation became the only legitimate reference for creating new independent states. The end of the multinational empires after World War I resulted in creating new state borders, not always coinciding with the territories of their peoples. With the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a new concept of the national state emerged as being governed by the rule of law. This was the end of the absolute state closed in itself. On the one hand, the state limited itself to, as it recognized the rights and freedoms of his citizens, and on the other hand, as it was involved in a web of rights and duties in its relations with other nation-states. New perspectives were opened with respect to the distinction between nation and state. Sovereignty does not only rest with the state. Each person enjoys a sphere of freedom from state intervention. Also, human groups within the state have a native right to live according to their cultural standards. Second part, the social doctrine of the Church. Where the Church draws her inspiration. Social doctrine of the Church take its inspiration from the Christian faith, which opens new horizons of sense. So in matters of people, nations and states, the New Testament brings something radically new. Pentecost is an actual counterpart to Babel. Humanity was divided and dispersed as a result of its pretension to equal God. Now a process of return to the lost unity is engaged. The Church constitutes a universal community of believers transcending national, cultural and state borders into something totally new and unknown elsewhere. The Christian Church rapidly grew in the framework of a multinational empire. The fathers of the Church praised the coincidence of a world empire which settled peace among rival peoples and nations, and a world religion organizing itself on a transnational basis. The spreading of the new faith meant the end of the city based on religion and on ethnic religions. A new bond could unite persons without distinction of social conditions, ethnic origin or cultural background. The Christian Church appreciated to deal with the Roman Empire, which was also potentially universal. In our postmodern society, there are no longer great stories, as in Romantic times, supplying individuals and nations with a deep sense of belonging and trying to put the history of one's nation in accordance with the history of the world. In the Church we have such a great story, namely the history of salvation. In a word, the Church has a duty to recompose the unity of all humanity. The final goal of history is to bring back, I quote, tribes, tongues and nations into the alliance with God. Christ in his body, I quote, has broken down the dividing wall between the Laos and the ethne, between the Ham and the Goyim. He might create of the two a single new humanity. So the Church is the new universal people in which all discrimination is abolished as an invitation to all nations to overcome enmity and to develop an awareness of fundamental unity. Why ethical principles are needed? The present situation can be sketched as follows. Conflicts between competing nation-states continue to threaten world peace. There is dissatisfaction inside nation-states as for the rights and duties of minorities. International cooperation does not meet all the requirements for a safe and well-ordered coexistence of nation-states. Nationalism, fueled by populism, is playing an increasing role in many nations, rejecting the cause of all problems on multilateralism and propagating a hostile image of the others. The social doctrine of the Church builds her vision on the human person as a member of a people, a nation, and a state. This vision inspires her discourse on these topics, a discourse based on rational thinking to be shared with all. Along with the priority of the human person as the center of the whole social construction, social doctrine of the Church calls on two principles, namely the fundamental unity of humanity and subsidiarity. A people as a given reality and the state as a construct. The teaching of John Paul II developed the concept of nation on the basis of its natural given elements, language, history, ethnical and cultural group. He expressed the wish that a Charter of the Rights of Nations may be adopted. For him, the Second World Conflict was a violation of the rights of weaker nations. After war, the rights of nations were not respected within their borders by imposition of a foreign totalitarian power and outside by absorption in the Soviet Empire. But nations are not always geographically homogeneous. John Paul recognized that the nation cannot always pretend to state sovereignty. He spoke of the sovereignty of the nation as a right to keep its language and culture, even in the form of a regional autonomy or a federal member state. He thought of Poland, which survived as a nation to 3 partitions in the 18th century and disappeared as a state until 1918. All nations have a right to live according to their customs and have duties of solidarity with others. John Paul praised patriotism and condemned nationalism. His message is, a nation is sovereign by its culture. John Paul's teaching reflects the situation of Poland, a nation-state which became more homogeneous with the reshaping of its borders after World War II. Recently, a French philosopher, François Julien, challenged this view, maintaining that there exists no cultural identity. The concept of identity, which is static, should be replaced by the idea of cultural resources, which means mutual enrichment. And the concept of differences between cultures should be replaced by that of gap, which means a possibility of interaction and dialogue. So the need to preserve humanity's rich cultural diversity does not mean freezing differences and fostering closed communitarianism, but researching the universal values which link people together. Culture means openness to the universal. Nobody lives only from what he has received from his own nation. Knowledge has no borders, and what is true everywhere. Now subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a principle which respects the human person in all her dimensions, as member of a family, a city, a cultural group. The juridical shaping of the state must take these consistent dimensions into account. Destruction of cultural minorities by the main group should not be accepted. A minority group may be as loyal to the nation as the dominant group if his specificity is recognized. In many cases, nation-states are no longer in a position to be really sovereign. Economic and social systems are intertwined. Nation-states are interdependent even for their own survival. This is particularly the case in Europe. By joining the European Union, nation-states do not put aside their identity, but try to adapt themselves to the real conditions of international competition. Now I examine the case of regional and local autonomies inside nation-states. International cooperation may end up in supranational cooperation. The first way has been explored in the 16th century, and this was the jus gentium, the law of nations, which was based on the idea that there exists a universal common good. And this has been picked up by the tradition of the church. The central state, which imposes restrictions to the free expression of local and regional specificities, does not act subsidiarily. Centralization, which eliminates inner cultural and historic data, is not really ready to share a part of its sovereignty with others, does not move realistically towards the future. So I think that the Catholic teaching fosters the idea of supranationality. And the European Union witnesses that the nation-state can no longer be considered as a last authority for promoting the common good. The reason is that a European common good clearly emerged during the last 50 years. In the European treatises, the competence of the Union is clearly settled according to the principle of subsidiarity. The Union should take care of those competences which a single nation-state are no longer in position to defend alone. For instance, defense and security, regulation of the economic and financial policy, environment, migration, foreign policy. So The principle of subsidiarity guarantees a more space for cultural minorities within nation states and more shared sovereignty between nation states. The idea developed by Coudenhove-Kalergi at the beginning of the last century was to separate the concepts of state and nations, and this is a fruitful idea. So I come to the conclusion, according to the principle of subsidiarity, nation states should strive to meet the legitimate demands for regional autonomies where they are wished. The concept of sovereignty can no longer be restricted to the nation state. It should be associated with all levels where a responsible authority is needed to regulate processes which are common to more nations. So the concept of state becomes gradually disconnected from the concept of exclusive territorial sovereignty. To avoid clashes of civilization or clashes of cultures, a double movement should be fostered. Where requested, more autonomy should be given to regional and provincial entities inside nation states. Forms of sovereignty should be recognized according to specific needs and on specific items to regional bodies or historic cultural groups. Nation states, which are no longer able to meet the request of their common good, should cooperate in shared sovereignty on those tasks which they are no longer able to fulfill alone. Education worldwide should inculcate the rejection of nationalism and populism as a mortal deviation of the legitimate love to one's own fatherland. Nations should be invited to give up the spirit of hegemony which prevails unto our times and find their self-realization in creative cooperation with others. I thank you.